Night fell. Shadows stretched across the barren landscape. A lone traveler, silhouetted against the dying light, made his way towards the whispering hills. Legend spoke of ancient spirits, their mournful cries echoing through the valleys. He shivered, pulling his coat tighter. The wind whispered, carrying with it the scent of rain and fear. He felt a cold dread creep into his heart. He had heard the stories, each one more unsettling than the last. Tales of lost souls forever bound to the hills and valleys, tales of chilling encounters and unexplained phenomena. He scoffed, trying to dismiss the fear that gnawed at him. But deep down, he knew, some stories were more than just stories. He reached the foot of the first hill. A weathered sign creaked in the wind, its message barely visible. Whispering pines, beware. He hesitated, the wind seeming to whisper a warning. He shook his head, banishing his fear. It was just the wind, it had to be. He took a deep breath and began his ascent. The air grew colder. The last rays of sunlight faded, plunging the path into darkness. He stumbled on, guided only by the faint moonlight that pierced the dense canopy above. He could hear the wind whispering through the trees, a low, mournful sound. It sounded like voices whispering his name. His pace quickened, driven by a sudden urge to escape. He arrived at a clearing, a dilapidated mine shaft gaping in the center. The entrance, dark and foreboding, seemed to beckon him closer, as if whispering secrets of the past. The air hung heavy, thick with the stench of damp earth and decay. The fog wrapped around him like a shroud, muffling the sounds of the forest and amplifying the eerie silence. The stories came flooding back, stories of miners lost in a tragic collapse, their souls forever trapped within the earth. He remembered the old photographs, the haunted eyes of the men who once toiled here, their dreams buried along with them. He felt a chill run down his spine. This place reeked of death and despair. The very air seemed to vibrate with the echoes of the past, a past filled with pain and suffering. He cautiously approached the mine shaft, each step echoing in the silence. The ground beneath his feet felt unstable, as if it could give way at any moment, swallowing him into the darkness below. He peered into the darkness, his breath catching in his throat. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, a black void that threatened to consume him. He thought he saw flickering lights dancing deep within the mine. They moved erratically like will-o'-the-wisps, leading him further into the abyss. And then he heard them, faint whispers, carried on the cold breeze emanating from the shaft. The voices were indistinct, but their tone was unmistakable, pleading, desperate. They seemed to be calling out, pleading for release. The faces of the lost miners appeared in his mind's eye, their hands reaching out from the shadows, begging for salvation. He stumbled backward, his heart pounding in his chest. The fear was palpable, a living entity that wrapped itself around him, squeezing the breath from his lungs. He couldn't make out the words, but the sheer sorrow and despair in those whispers chilled him to the bone. The ghostly faces seemed to float before him, their eyes filled with an unending torment. He knew then that the stories were true. This place was haunted, plagued by the restless spirits of the lost miners. The mine was a tomb, a prison for souls that could find no peace. He turned to flee, his mind screaming at him to get as far away from this cursed place as possible. The forest seemed to close in around him, the trees becoming twisted sentinels that watched his every move. But as he did, he heard a deep rumbling sound. It was as if the earth itself was groaning in pain, a low, ominous growl that reverberated through the ground. The ground beneath him began to shake. He struggled to keep his balance, the tremors growing stronger with each passing second. He turned back to the mine shaft, a sense of dread washing over him. The darkness seemed to pulse, alive with a malevolent energy. A thick black smoke billowed from the depths of the mine, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. The air was filled with the acrid smell of burning, a scent that stung his eyes and throat. He watched in horror as the smoke began to take shape, swirling and contorting into grotesque figures. The forms were twisted and nightmarish, their faces a mask of agony. The lost miners had come for him. Their spectral hands reached out, their eyes filled with a longing that transcended death. He knew he had to escape, but the pull of the mine was strong, a magnetic force that threatened to drag him into the abyss. He ran. He didn't know how long he ran, but the screams of the miners echoed in his ears, urging him onward. The forest seemed to close in around him, the trees becoming a blur as he pushed himself to keep moving. He finally collapsed, gasping for breath, in a secluded glen. His legs felt like lead and his lungs burned with every breath he took. A single willow tree stood in the center, its branches weeping down towards a stagnant pond. The tree's silhouette was haunting, its long, drooping branches swaying gently in the breeze. An unnatural stillness hung in the air, broken only by the gentle rustling of leaves. It was as if the glen itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. He slowly got to his feet, his body trembling with exhaustion and fear. Every muscle in his body ached, but he knew he couldn't stay there. The glen was eerily silent, save for the gentle lapping of the water against the bank. The sound was almost hypnotic, drawing him closer to the pond. He cautiously approached the pond, drawn by a strange sense of foreboding. His heart pounded in his chest, each step feeling heavier than the last. The water was dark, reflecting nothing but the oppressive darkness of the surrounding woods. It was as if the pond was a portal to another world, one filled with shadows and despair. As he peered into the murky depths, he saw it. A flicker of movement, a shadow that seemed to shift and change. A pale face stared back at him, its eyes wide with a mixture of sorrow and malice. The face seemed to float just beneath the surface, its features distorted by the rippling water. He recoiled in horror, stumbling backward. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he had just seen. The face vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving only ripples in the water. The pond's surface returned to its eerie stillness, as if nothing had happened. He had heard whispers of the glen, rumors of a young woman who had drowned in the pond, driven to despair by a broken heart. The stories had always seemed like mere ghost tales meant to scare children. They said her spirit remained forever bound to the willow tree, her mournful cries echoing through the glen. The thought sent a shiver down his spine. He had dismissed them as mere folklore, but now he wasn't so sure. The face in the water, the oppressive atmosphere, it all felt too real. He turned to leave, his heart pounding in his chest. He needed to get away from this place, to escape the haunting presence that seemed to linger in the air. But as he did, he heard a soft sob coming from behind him. The sound was faint but unmistakable. He froze, his blood turning to ice. The sobbing was filled with such sorrow it was almost unbearable. The sobbing grew louder, filled with an unbearable sadness that seemed to claw at his sanity. It was as if the very soul of the glen was crying out in pain, and he was powerless to stop it. He spun around, his eyes frantically searching the darkness, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. He could see nothing, but the sobbing continued, echoing through the glen, a haunting sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. And then he heard it. A melody, played on a flute, drifted through the air, weaving through the trees like a ghostly whisper. It was beautiful, yet filled with an aching sadness that mirrored the sobbing, a tune that seemed to tell a story of lost love and endless sorrow. He followed the sound, his feet moving as if in a trance, drawn by the melancholy notes that seemed to pull at his very soul. The melody grew louder as he approached the willow tree, its ancient branches swaying gently in the moonlight. He stopped at the edge of the pond, his gaze drawn to the base of the tree where the shadows seemed to dance and shift. And there, amidst the gnarled roots, he saw her, a figure so ethereal it was as if she had stepped out of a dream. A young woman, her long dark hair cascading down her back like a silken waterfall shimmering in the pale light. She wore a white dress, tattered and torn, her face as pale as moonlight, her eyes closed as she played the mournful tune. She sat with her back to him, her head bowed, her slender fingers moving delicately over the holes of a wooden flute, each note a tear falling from her soul. She was the source of the heartbreaking melody that filled the air, a melody that seemed to resonate with the very essence of the forest. He stood there, frozen in place, his mind struggling to comprehend what he was seeing, the surreal beauty and sorrow of the scene overwhelming him. He wanted to look away, to run, but something held him captive, a force stronger than fear, a need to understand the sorrow that bound her. The woman's grief was palpable, a tangible presence that seemed to suffocate him, wrapping around his heart like a cold, unyielding hand. As the last note faded away, the woman slowly lifted her head, her movements graceful, yet filled with an unbearable weight. Her eyes, dark and filled with an ancient sorrow, met his, and in that gaze he saw centuries of pain and longing, and in that moment he felt a connection, a shared understanding of the pain and despair that haunted this place, a bond forged in the fires of shared suffering. He wanted to reach out to her, to offer her comfort, but he knew it was futile, for her sorrow was a part of her, as inseparable as her shadow. She was lost, her spirit forever bound to the willow glen, a ghostly figure trapped in an endless night, her melody a lament for a life that could never be.